So does the Old Testament point to some sort of God-man that would rescue people from their sins?
Well, all you have to do is read the first chapter of Hebrews.
Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. All right, I'm messing around. I don't want to see. Here's the thing. This is a video from Wretched Radio. They're talking about Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro says that there's, like, the Old Testament has a completely different view of who the Messiah is than the New Testament. That it never predicts a God coming down to earth and the whole nine. And I agree with the guy, but this is biblical anarchy. I'm Steve Perry. It doesn't matter what I think. What does the Bible say? Now, I'm going to fix what I just did because it wasn't nice. But they trash talk Shapiro a little bit because they say that he's listening to the rabbis. He doesn't read the Bible. I think he reads the Bible. I don't know. But let's get away from the ad hominem and play the full clip of what this gentleman said, because what I did was unfair.
All you have to do is read the first chapter of Hebrews to see that the Old Testament is full of references. They are sometimes shrouded in mystery.
Types and shadows. He's a better Melchizedek, a better high priest, right, better than the angels, etc.
Like all of prophecy, I think, is somewhat mysterious, so that you recognize it when it happens. You don't necessarily predict it, ahead of time.
Now, that's sad. I'm sorry, that's just sad. All of prophecy is just like, you don't, once it happens, you recognize it, but we'll get into that later because we're going to get into a pretty obvious prophecy. And mind you, you can argue whether or not this prophecy ever happened, but now from their perspective, as you're going to see, they kind of have to go with this version of prophecy.
I couldn't help but think about Isaiah 53.
Yeah, well, that's the key passage, actually, yeah.
Let me just scan over this. He was despised, rejected by man, a man of sorrows, despised. He was borne our griefs, carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. We like sheep have gone astray. He was oppressed and afflicted. We thought that he was dying for his own sins, but he was actually dying for the sins of his people. That verse tells us that at least this Messiah is going to be the atoner for sin.
Right.
That's a tough one. It really is. That's the one I struggled with the most. It's gotta be Jesus, right? Let's dive down. Now, there are 4 servant songs in Isaiah scattered between Isaiah 42 and 53. So, let's take a look through Isaiah. We're going to start in chapter 41. Why? Because in Isaiah 53, the last of the 4 servant songs, they're saying that the servant is Messiah. Ben Shapiro saying it's not the servant. Doesn't matter what they think, doesn't matter what I think. Question is, what does Isaiah say? So let's scroll through Isaiah 41:8. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen. That doesn't sound like it's the Messiah who's the servant. But is this a one-off? Let's keep scrolling down. 42 here. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. In the very next chapter, who's the servant? Christians are going to say this is the Messiah. But Isaiah just identified it. The servant is Israel, right? If we go with what Isaiah said, let's keep going. Scroll down through. Basically what I've done is I've highlighted, I think I missed one right there, but I'm just going to skip it because there's plenty. I've highlighted them in red. Now, one of the problems you're going to get to when you get to Isaiah 53, you're going to say, Steve, he, it's singular, right? You are my witnesses, declares the Lord. This is Isaiah 43. And my servant, whom I have chosen. My witness says, and my servant. Yeah, the servant is a group of people. Why does he say witnesses? Well, witnesses all observe different things, but they are one servant in that they have one task, one destiny. We continue to scroll. I love this ESV website because you can just make an account, highlight the stuff, and do this. Israel, the Lord's chosen. But now hear, O Jacob, my servant, Israel, whom I have chosen. That's 44:1. 44:2. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, Yeshurun, whom I have chosen. This is, remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. I formed you. You are my servant. That's 44:21. I mean, over and over again, between these servant songs, here we are in 45:4. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen. I don't care what they think. I care what Isaiah thinks. This is what Isaiah is telling us. I know I skipped one there. Looking for the highlights, scrolling down, here we go. The Lord has remembered his servant Jacob. Isaiah 48:20. Again, it's Jacob. Now this one's interesting because this is in the servant song. Okay, here's the song, highlighted in blue, right in the middle of it. And he said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Right in the song. Israel is the servant. We continue along. Here's the next servant song. Now notice it doesn't identify him directly in the song there. We're now to Isaiah 51. And I think some of my highlights didn't take. But as you can see, now we're in 50. Here is the final one. So, behold, my servant shall act wisely, for he shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. And then at the end of the servant song, I think it's the last verse, but he is identified as the servant. Here we go, verse, the next 11. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied by his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. So the song's about the servant. Now, I can go with what Ben Shapiro says, or I can go with what Todd Friel over at Wretched Radio says, or I can just ask Isaiah. Why not? Crazy idea. Why not ask Isaiah who the servant is that he's talking about? It's just, it makes sense to me. So that's Isaiah 53. To say that Ben Shapiro isn't reading his scripture is just, listen, I'm not going to say these guys don't read their scriptures, but they start in the New Testament, so they have a different view of these things. Ben Shapiro's reading his scriptures. Isaiah told him who the servant is. That's why he doesn't think it's Jesus. Next.
No question.
What other verses tell us in the Old Testament this Messiah would be God?
Well, I would think of, for example, Micah 5:2 is the famous passage that predicts Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. And it refers to him as the one whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. So he's an everlasting being born in Bethlehem.
An everlasting being. Does that describe Jesus? Everlasting? I would think you'd go with eternal. Matter of fact, the King James does go with eternal there. A couple of the other versions do too. This is an interesting one to look at, okay? Micah 5:2. Let's pull it up. This is on Bible Hub, so we get all the different translations. New International Version from Ancient Times. New Living Translation, The Distant Past. English Standard Version from Ancient Days. Berean Study Bible from the Days of Eternity. There you go. King James from Everlasting. New American Standard from the Days of Eternity. So you see, now let's click over here and go to the Interlinear Version. And we see the word here. It says everlasting. Now if we click on a word, there are a ton of places where this word is used in the Bible, okay? Perpetual, everlasting covenant, everlasting, everlasting is, permanent, perpetual. it goes on and on. Now, what's interesting, let's scroll down here. Nowhere is it eternal. That's the important part, because I think he's conflating the two. If we get down here we go, Micah 5:2, New American Standard, and both of these do from the days of eternity, the days of eternity. But they take the same word in Micah 7:14, as in the days of old, as in the days of old, as in Gilead, the days of old. Right? So they all switch over to days of old just 5 chapters later. Right? Or 2 chapters later, excuse me. Like, something fishy's going on there, right? But if we just take the verse and we read it, let's use the English Standard Version, what we've been using. But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. That seems like a reasonable translation to me. Nothing in there to me implies that he's God. When you take the word eternity and conflate it, or from everlasting, and conflate it with eternal, as he appears to do, I mean, you could argue that, well, Jesus wasn't everlasting. He died, but he was also God, according to Christians. But as God, he's eternal, not everlasting. They don't argue that he came into existence at some point and then will continue to exist from there on out. That's everlasting. It has a start, but it doesn't have a finish. Eternal has neither a start nor finish. So I'm sorry. I don't really see his point here. I don't see how he gets that out of that verse. We have one more passage that they reference in here,
I think. And then Isaiah, the other Christmas prophecies, Isaiah 9:6, for example, he'll be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace.
Now, we both kind of have a problem here, I would say, because I'm going to argue, well, excuse me, I'm going to look at the Bible and figure this out, but from my standpoint, I would argue that Mighty God isn't talking about Jesus. Who's it talking about then? And he's going to argue that Everlasting Father is talking about Jesus, but he's the Son. We've all seen the triangle diagram, right? You got the Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God. The Father is not the Son is not the Father. So why would they say, I mean, think about this. Now, notice earlier they said prophecies are so vague, you never know what's coming. From that viewpoint, I guess you could argue that. But I don't see prophecies as being that vague. Let's take a look at where this prophecy shows up is in Isaiah 9, like he says, starting in verse 2. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor you have broken, as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior and battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Now, sometimes it's a little difficult to connect a prophecy with the fulfillment. And this would be one of these cases, because it's a poetic prophecy. So yeah, this is one of the ones that's not as clear as some of the others. But he leaves us a nice little bookmark at the end. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Wow, I just saw this. Okay, 2 Kings 19:31 and Isaiah 37:32. I just saw it. Look what I have up here. Isaiah 37. Do I have 32? No, because I want to go back to the point about prophecy being so vague. Listen to this. You can't really see what's coming, but once it's there, then you can kind of connect the dots. Is that how prophecy works? Isaiah 37, verse 6. Isaiah said to them, "Say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the young men of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." Now, what does that sound like is going to happen? Is it vague? Or is he going to run off scared to his own land and fall by the sword? Let's scroll down to the end. What does it say? "And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch, his god, Adramelech and Sharezer, his sons, struck him down with the sword. And after they escaped into the land of Ararat." Now see, fair, I had just read it, right? But certainly, it didn't take a rocket scientist to connect those dots, did it? The thing I really want to focus on, Isaiah 37:32, right here, "The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." Wait a second. Is this tied to Hezekiah? It would seem so. Now, there's one other place. As you saw when I hovered, there's one other place, 2 Kings 19. And in 2 Kings 19, we see this once again, "The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." Will do what? Listen up. "And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians." Sound familiar? "And when the people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and lived at Nineveh. And as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch, his god." It's the same thing. The only place, there's three places in all of the Bible where this is used, "The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." Isaiah 9, Isaiah 37, and 2 Kings 19, right? Now, let me ask you this. The city of Jerusalem is surrounded by 185,000 Assyrians. There's no way out, right? And suddenly, the army dies, attacks each other, whatever. You don't believe the story, fine. This is the story. So, they wake up in the morning and all these people are dead and the king has hightailed it back to Nineveh, right? What are we to make of this? Now let's read this again and see if this sounds like something that might match up with that story. "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, and they are glad when they divide the spoil, for the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor you have broken, as on the day of Midian." What's Midian? I think it's Judges chapter 8. I don't have it pulled up here. I'm not even going to look. The story of Midian, listen, you got Gideon, right? Gideon goes out and gets these troops together to go fight Midian. I think he's got like 10,000 troops or something like that. And God says, "That's too many. Because I don't want you thinking that you guys did this. I want you to know that I did this. So, everybody who's scared, go home." Now they got like 3,000 troops, right? I don't remember the numbers. I'm spitballing it here. Roughly. So, after those were left with this smaller group of troops, and God does it again. He says, "Send them down to the river to drink the water." Some of them cup it up and drink it. Others just stick their face right in the water and start lapping it up like a dog. He said, everybody lapped it up like a dog. They go home. So they go home. And you're left with 300 to 500 people, I think it was. and they don't take up weapons. Their weapons are like trumpets and something else. They make a lot of noise. The Midianites get scared. They attack each other and kill each other. So Israel wins this battle without raising a weapon, just like what happened here, right? So the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. What do they do with the 185,000 dead bodies, right? Burn them up. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Hezekiah, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Wait, it says Mighty God. Why did I say Hezekiah? Meaning, origin, and history of the name Hezekiah. From the Hebrew name, which means God strengthens. From the roots meaning strength and God, referring to the Hebrew God. His name will be called Hezekiah. Mighty God. God is mighty. God is strong. God strengthens. I think that pretty much wraps it up for me. Now, if you're starting in the New Testament and that's your theology, and that's fine, I'm not criticizing that. You're obviously going to say it's about Jesus because for unto us a child is born. No, I don't think that is quoted. What is, I know it's quoted. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. The funny thing is, if you have a Tanakh, this is actually Isaiah 9:1, but in the Christian Bible it's 9:2 because Matthew takes the last verse of the poem in the chapter before and the first verse of this poem and crunches them together. And so the Christian Bible bumps it to keep it from breaking up what Matthew did with it. But it's kind of interesting because if you read this and say, his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Yet not one New Testament author takes this and runs with it and says, see, it said it'll be Mighty God. But it's not used by any of the New Testament authors. So, if you start in the New Testament, everything they just said is going to make sense to you. If you start in Tanakh, everything Ben Shapiro said, which I didn't play, is going to make sense to you. Here's the point. Let's not beat each other up and say you're not reading the Bible. I just went through, and I'm not trying to convince you or win you over to my point of view. I just went through and laid out why I see it the way I see it, okay? You see it differently? That's fine. And you've got New Testament verses to back it up. But we don't have to attack each other and say this guy's not reading his Bible, this guy's being duped by the pastors or the rabbis or whatever. We don't really have to do that. We can get along and say, hey, you see it differently than I do? But that doesn't mean you can't like this video, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel. Don't just sit there, do something.